Hello and welcome to the Long Jawn Sports Podcast, Episode 1, Combine, QBs, and Coaching. A little introduction on myself. My name is Joseph Camperman, and I will be your host at the Long Jawn Sports Podcast. I've been an Eagles fan for many years, and one of the first players that I can remember that got me involved and introduced to the Eagles was Michael Vick, among many other Eagles players. I always admired his story of redemption and how he came back from a terrible start to his NFL career in his personal life, not in his career, but in his personal life. And that definitely was one of my deciding factors on why I became an Eagles fan, among many other reasons, which I'll go into in another episode. So for topic number 1, I'm going to discuss Eagles draft analysis. This time of the year is the most vital time of the year for teams to figure out their path moving forward for not just this upcoming season, but really multiple seasons. General managers, their job never ends, but ultimately, at the end of the day, this time of the year is probably the groundwork and the most important time for an NFL team to make a run to the Super Bowl. We always worry about wins, but the truth is the wins start with the decisions that both the coaching and the general manager decide to make throughout the offseason, which is right now. So as we lead up to the NFL draft, the NFL Combine has just wrapped up yesterday as I'm filming this, and we are now looking forward to not just the NFL draft, but the league new year, which is quickly approaching. Topic number 1, going into the Eagles draft analysis, starting with their combine meetings. It's incredibly difficult to figure out who all they met with because ultimately you're relying on reporters and fans and people who are posting like this is who they met with. There's not an official page where the NFL releases who they met with. So I'm going to talk about 2 players that they met with that stood out to me that could be potential day 1 picks for the Eagles. Now, one thing to note is the Eagles draft is they don't have a ton of draft capital. So you're going to see one of 2 things, in my opinion. They're either going to draft exactly what their needs are, which is what they've done relatively well in the last 2 years, especially last year. They nailed it. Or you're going to see them draft back and collect picks for not just this year, but next year. We know next year they're going to have a first-round pick and 2 second-round picks because of a trade last year with the Saints. So I imagine that Howie Roseman, they right now sit with 5 picks in the draft, 2 in the first round, 1 in the second, 1 in the third round, and then 1 in the 7th round. And so or 2 in the 7th round. They may have 6 picks, but either way, they have a limited amount of picks, and they're going to need to be able to get more if they want to build this team due to the impending free agents that are leaving. And we could call it what it is, but at this point, it's very likely that they lose quite a few starters, especially on defense. So going into the Eagles combine meetings, the 2 players that stood out to me, the first one, Kelee Ringo from Georgia. He's a guy that you could see them get potentially later on in the draft. They met with him. He, over 3 years in Georgia, had 76 total tackles, 3 tackles for loss, and 4 interceptions. While his stats don't jump out at you on paper, this Georgia defense was legendary the last 2 years especially, but has been really, really good for the last 3. They've competed very well, and so ultimately his stats probably don't show maybe how well he played. I don't think he's a top 15 pick by any means unless cornerbacks just go off the board really quickly, which I do foresee happening. I don't see Kelee Ringo being a problem to be picked later on in the draft. My second player that I'm going to stand out about, and this one's an interesting one, is Jahmyr Gibb from Alabama. The Eagles typically don't really focus on running backs drafting them, period. Miles Sanders was the anomaly when they drafted him in the 2nd round. They're not drafting a running back in the 1st round, in my opinion. But he is a potential because of what he did at Alabama. He transferred from Georgia Tech last year and had an amazing all-purpose season with Alabama both receiving and rushing the football. 1,200 plus all-purpose yards at Alabama, and previously before transferring, he had a good season in 21 at Georgia Tech. He doesn't have a lot of mileage on him, and so he could be a guy you see the Eagles pick in the early 2nd round if he's available. And that's really all depends on where Bijan Robinson from Texas ends up. If he goes really early on in the draft, I could see a team that's really needing a running back picking him towards the end of this 1st round. So that's moving into my next option. My next topic under the Eagles draft analysis is, what are their options at pick number 10? So at pick number 10, they have a few ways they could go. Ultimately, the way I look at it is the Eagles have always built in the trenches. So part of me wants to say they're either picking a D-line or an O-line in the first round. A lot of this depends on who they lose in free agency. So this is somewhat of a lot of this could change. This is sort of a pre-idea of what I think they'll do, but it could change so much in the next week, let alone the next day. And so as I'm filming this right now, Jason Kelce hasn't been re-signed. He's a free agent and could retire. Isaac Samuel is a free agent and more than likely won't re-sign with the Eagles. So there is some O-line differences, like issues there, and potentially some deficiencies. Now, Cam Jurgens from the center that they drafted last year should replace Kelce. If Kelce comes back, Jurgens will more than likely shift to right guard, and then they won't have an issue on the O-line. So as you see, that's just one little area that the Eagles could change. And then, of course, everything I'm talking about may not end up becoming true. But that's the point of these forecasts, is we know they're not potentially going to be true, but it gives fans and listeners an idea of where we're heading. So at player option at number 10, the Jalen Carter situation, which surfaced late last week, for Eagles fans, whether you like it or not, could be a good thing. Jalen Carter is going to slide down the draft board. So he was arguably looked at as one of the best college prospects coming out. Him and Will Anderson looked like they were 1 and 2 respectively, depending on how you looked at it. And more than likely, a lot of people expected Jalen Carter to be gone within the first 5 picks. There is a real chance that depending on how the quarterbacks fall, which we will focus on later on in the show, that Jalen Carter slips to number 10. I highly doubt it, and it's a big question mark there. But do look, if he is available at number 10 and he handled the process of the answering all the issues that have come to light with his legal issues, there's a chance that he does slip out of the top 10. And then it's truly, do you want the Eagles to get him or not? Number 2 is Devin Witherspoon out of cornerback out of Illinois. We know defensive back is an issue for the Eagles this year. They are losing potentially up to 3 starters in their defensive backfield with Marcus Epps, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, and James Bradbury, all free agents and expected to potentially depart. I believe 1, if not 2 of those people will be returning, but that's a real possibility. Option number 3 at 10, Christian Gonzalez is a real possibility. He's the cornerback out of Oregon. He had an excellent pro day, and a lot of people expect him to be the first cornerback off the board. I don't think he's going to be available at pick number 10, but that is an option. Now, option number 4, which is what I believe, and I posted on my weekly news on Instagram, on the Long Jawn Podcast Instagram account. Check it out. I post weekly snippets every Sunday. And what I posted there is that I believe they will trade back out of their 10th pick to something maybe middle of the round, like pick 15, and pick Joey Porter Jr., cornerback out of Penn State. We know defensive back is an area of concern. I think it would be a great opportunity for them to collect some more draft picks, maybe an extra second-round pick, who knows, maybe even a first-round pick, to move back, give someone the ability to maybe move into the top 10 to pick a quarterback maybe, or to pick a top defensive player, and then they settle with a guy like Joey Porter. I wouldn't like that. It wouldn't be my favorite pick, but I wouldn't be upset with it. Finally, we go into the defensive line. You got Myles Murphy from Clemson. He's arguably looked at as one of the best pass rushers, not interior defensive line, but pass rushers in the draft. I could see him potentially not being available at that pick, but I still think it's a real possibility at 10, Myles Murphy's is there. And finally, as my final and 6th option for pick player options at number 10, which could change, Brian Bresee. Every time I see he's out of Clemson, he's either going in like the early parts of the teens or he's going in the late part of the first round. So I'm not entirely sure why teams view him differently, but he's an option as potentially a trade back piece similar to the Joey Porter situation. Now, player options at 30 get a little bit difficult because obviously there's a lot of opportunity for teams to pick during those first 30 picks, and you could end up with steals if there's 5 quarterbacks picked in the first round, or if teams decide we're not going to take chances on the quarterbacks, which all the experts expect them to do, then there could be an opportunity for players to be picked that typically would be more second-round players. Pick 30 is almost like a second-round pick the way you look at it. And the reason why it's pick 30 is because the Miami Dolphins lost their first-round pick, and so technically it would be pick 31. But because they forfeited their first-round pick, pick 30 is where the Eagles land. One of my top options at pick 30 would be Jahmyr Gibbs from Alabama. I don't think he's going to make it to the Eagles' second-round pick, so if they really want a running back, they may want to consider getting someone with pick 30. Personally, it's not my favorite pick, but I could see it happen due to the fact that Miles Sanders is almost indefinitely leaving, and so is potentially Boston Scott, leaving only Trey Sermon and not Kenny Golladay and Kenneth Gainwell on the roster, and that's not a bad group of running backs, but certainly not somebody I'd want to roll through with the whole season. I like their running back core, but I just don't know if they're proven enough to be able to carry that. So I do believe the Eagles will either go through free agency or the draft and try to get a running back. So he's the first person that I would say. The next person would be Brian Bresee, which is out of Clemson, which we just talked about. I could see the Eagles potentially moving maybe up to like pick 26 to pick him if they really feel like he was good enough to pick there. And remains to be seen during his pro day whether or not he wow scouts enough to be picked at that higher up in the draft. For my third and final option for player to be picked at number 30, it'd be Khalil Ringo cornerback out of Georgia, which I just spoke about earlier on. I think he's a real opportunity. If you go defensive line or offensive line or linebacker with the first of your first round picks, you may want to consider getting a defensive back. It really all depends on whether they bring back Bradbury, Johnson, or Epps. If they bring back two of those players, I can't see defensive back being a very important position for the Eagles to pick. But I doubt they're bringing back both with the impending Hurts contract, which we'll more than likely get to at a later podcast, because whether it gets worked out tomorrow or 2 weeks from now, it's going to be a hot topic for the remainder of the offseason for the Eagles. So ultimately, my take would be, I think they're trading back in this year in one of those two picks, either trading out of the first round with their pick 30 and collecting some more later picks, or trading back with their pick number 10 and collecting some maybe second round and potentially first round picks for teams that are needy. My option would be, if I were to pick, I would want a defensive back first and a defensive lineman with pick 30, but that's just my opinion. Topic number 2, QB dilemma at the combine. So this is an interesting one because ultimately for the last 3 months we've heard Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and then Will Levis. It's not like he came onto the scene, but Will Levis was always that third running quarterback. Up until the last month, I didn't hear Richardson's name even being talked about. But now you've got Richardson out of Florida, who had an electric pro day, and he has surpassed Will Levis as number 3 on the QB rankings chart. The interesting part about this is, are teams high enough on him to take him ahead of more pro-ready quarterbacks like CJ Stroud out of Ohio State or Bryce Young out of Alabama? If they don't feel confident in Will Levis's ability as a starting quarterback, you could definitely see Richardson leapfrog Levis and potentially even leapfrog Stroud or Young. You know, there's reports that are coming out saying that teams could pick him first overall in the draft. And while I think that's a little bit foolish because he's an incredibly talented athlete, but you got to be coached right. And if he ends up in the wrong situation, we know what happens to players who potentially had a great ceiling, but they end up in the wrong coaching hands, and it's a disaster. So I am curious to see what happens. It's very difficult to sort of judge the Stroud versus Young because Stroud participated in the combine and seemed to have overall one of the better combines performances out of the QBs. But until Young has his pro day, it's tough to see who will be picked first because Young wowed in team meetings, but he didn't throw or run the 40-yard dash or do those measurements at the combine. And so while everyone expects Young to be picked first, I could see a guy like Stroud being picked ahead of Young because of the fact that Stroud seems to be maybe a little bit more pro-ready or pro-suited. So ultimately, what it really boils down to is, if Young is picked ahead of CJ Stroud, where does Stroud fall in the draft line? So my take on the QBs goes as follows. Assuming there's no trades, which I do strongly believe there are trades, but ultimately after CJ Stroud had a great performance, and so did Richardson, can the Bears actually get what they wanted out of that first round pick? Because all 3 of those quarterbacks, I think, have the potential to all do well in the NFL. So Are there going to be teams wanting to jump in front of each other for a specific quarterback in mind? And I would beg to differ that may have changed a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. So my predictions are Young goes number 2 to Houston. I think that they want to keep a guy he's incredibly intelligent from a football standpoint in the way he reads blitzes and moves in the pocket. He's a small guy, but he uses his size in a way better than Kyler Murray. And he's getting a lot of Kyler Murray comparisons. I could go into a long comparison battle on why he shouldn't be compared to Kyler Murray. I think it's a little bit foolish just because he's short and he is small in stature. It's difficult to compare him to Kyler Murray. I think he potentially could have a better career than Kyler Murray, depending on the coaching. And I like what DeMeco Ryans is doing in Houston, so I would foresee him more than likely landing in Houston. So I have Young going number 2 to Houston. Number 4, I have Stroud going to the Colts. I am a firm believer that one of these two teams is going to trade to leapfrog the other, whether it's Houston trading to pick 1 to make sure no one trades to pick 1, or Colts trading to pick 1 to make sure they pick maybe a Young over Stroud, depending on how they view him and depending on how teams view Stroud. Because if they think Houston's going to pick Stroud with pick number 2, they may not want Young at pick number 4. So we know pick number 3 with the Cardinals more than likely is not going to be a quarterback, but the Cardinals could even shift their pick. So there's so much that could change right now. It's a very interesting situation, and it's going to continue to unfold as we get closer to the draft. We're going to get a little bit more clarity on how teams view these players, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there is so much uncertainty until that clock strikes. We may not know who teams are going to pick. Now, Richardson, I have him going 3rd. And this is a little bit of a tough one because I think Richardson has an opportunity to potentially go 4th. However, I have him right now going 3rd to the Panthers at number 9. And the reason why is I don't discredit Will Levis and the success he's had, but I have a feeling that there is a chance that depending on how the quarterback market goes this year, which I will get to in a later part of the show, depending on how the quarterback situation goes from a veteran quarterback situation, I have a feeling there may only be 3 quarterbacks in the top 10 picked. So right now I have Levis going at number 13 to the Jets. It's not a flashy pick, and I'm not entirely sure if I'm totally for that pick. I think Levis could be one of those guys that's he looks like an NFL quarterback. The question is, how high is his ceiling? And are the Jets willing to gamble on a guy who maybe doesn't have as high of a ceiling as a guy like Richardson or C.J. Stroud or Young? Specifically Richardson. So I could see potentially the Panthers going number 9 and picking Levis if Richardson is gone before then. But I think if Richardson ends up in the Panthers' lap at pick 9, I don't see how they can miss out on him. I'm not saying I'm for that pick, but it just seems to me that that's the way it's going to go. Moving along to topic number 3, Eagles coaching news. So, as most of you know that's been watching the sports world, the Eagles were absolutely picked apart after the Super Bowl loss. It was a tough thing for Eagles fans to watch, but ultimately, if you're a fan of the Eagles, you're incredibly happy that your coordinators are moving on, because ultimately, unless they're fired, it means they're doing a good job. And Steichen did a phenomenal job, to put it lightly, with Hurts. From year 1 to year 2, Hurts took an incredible leap. But many people credited that leap partly to Brian Johnson, which is why I'm incredibly excited that the Eagles decided to promote Brian Johnson. He had a ton of suitors wanting him to be an offensive coordinator for them. The Eagles ultimately promoted Brian Johnson to offensive coordinator, and I think that this is going to bode well for them. They also announced the hiring of Sean Desai to defensive coordinator last week to replace the gaping hole to what some people say was when Gannon left. I personally don't believe that, and I know a lot of Eagles fans tend to agree. I've heard people from the outside going, Gannon had all these sacks. Gannon had a great defense. But if you look at the stars on that Eagles defense, I'm not entirely sure it was all for coaching. So they hired offensive coordinator Brian Johnson. They promoted him from QB's coach to offensive coordinator, and they hired Sean Desai, who served as the associate head coach and defense assistant for the Seattle Seahawks. I think it's a little bit difficult to focus on him to say, oh, he did terrible in Seattle, because they didn't have a whole lot to work with. ultimately, when I look at what they did have to work with when it came to the rookies, I think he made the most out of it. Tariq Woolen had a great year for the Seahawks, so I'm not really worried about Tariq Woolen. About Sean Desai's ability to coach players. He had a great defense in Chicago 2 years ago where Robert Quinn posted 18 and a half sacks in 2021. Not saying that the defense was the best defense in the NFL that year, but I think Sean Desai is going to be a great hire for them. My analysis on Brian Johnson is that he has known Hurts since he was 3 years old because Hurts' father, coincidentally, coached Johnson in high school. And he was a quarterback in high school, and he coached him. So he's a highly respected coach in league circles. And I firmly do, and I know a lot of analysts believe that he is going to be a head coach in a few years. I think the way that he's conducted himself, the way that he has helped Hurts improve from year 1 to year 2 as a starter, I think it goes without saying that he is more than likely going to get a head coaching opportunity, and I want that for him. Ultimately, I believe he will elevate Hurts' game and may even call better plays than Steichen because he was in the room with him working on all these fundamentals last year with Hurts, and he knows where Hurts plays well and where Hurts maybe needs to improve on. And I think that because of that relationship that they had, that promotion was really key and incredibly smart on behalf of the Eagles for promoting him instead of bringing in an outside option, which there were some. Moving on to Sean Desai and my analysis of his hiring by the Eagles. He's a Vic Fangio disciple. I don't know how to feel about the whole Vic Fangio decision. I know a lot of people expected Gannon to be gone early on in the coaching window, and everyone expected Vic Fangio, who had been serving as a defensive advisor for the Eagles the last year or two, they expected him to just slot right in. Well, Vic Fangio took one of the most lucrative defensive coordinator contracts in the NFL. In fact, I think he's the highest paid defensive coordinator, and he took that contract, and he is bringing his talents to Miami, whether Eagles fans like it or not. Wasn't their option. So they turned to Desai, who many believe is one of the most creative young coaches and looked at very respectively in league circles. A lot of people probably expect him to be a head coach as well. So the Eagles are hiring guys that they may not have for more than a year, which could be good, could be bad. It's incredibly exciting. Time to be an Eagles fan because there is a lot of uncertainty, which I personally like because it means you never know what's going to happen, and that's sometimes a good thing. Sometimes terrible. One question that I've seen in a lot of league circles is, will Sean Desai be willing to make the in-game changes to his defensive game plan, something that Gannon didn't or wouldn't, regardless of what you want to look at it. During the Super Bowl, Gannon could have made some changes, and he didn't. And I could go into an analysis of it. I thought about doing that, but for time's sake, I don't want to go into analysis on what I believe Gannon did wrong. But to put it lightly, the Eagles ran a lot of zone coverage all year long. And whether it frustrated Eagles fans or not, both plays that resulted in wide open touchdowns for the Kansas City Chiefs were a direct result of playing man coverage, something that after the first blown touchdown probably should not have happened on the exact same play call, just flipped side of the field. That's a little bit of a tangent, but because of Gannon's inability to make in-game changes, I firmly believe that was one of the number one reasons why the Eagles lost the Super Bowl. And you had even players throwing him under the bus, like C.J. Gardner-Johnson saying he didn't give us the play, he didn't make changes that put us in the best position to win. So I do believe that the hiring of Sean Desai is a good breath of fresh air. The difficult part is, how will the Eagles surround this coach with defensive players when a lot of them are set to hit free agency? You've got defensive lineman Hargrave, Cox, and Graham potentially leaving. TJ Edwards and Kazir White potentially leaving on the linebacker side of the football. And then in the defensive back side of the football, you've got cornerback James Bradbury and safeties Marcus Epps and C.J. Gardner-Johnson potentially leaving this year. So if they don't bring in enough talent, is it really going to be Desai's fault if this defense sort of falls off a little bit, which I do expect to happen because I don't expect them to replicate the 70-plus sack season they had last year. I think they'll be good, but it's all depending on what they do in the draft and free agency and who they bring back. One of the biggest concerns that I have for this Sean Desai hiring was the Eagles announced yesterday, which we're filming this Monday night, so keep in mind that when I mean yesterday, I mean Sunday. The Eagles announced Sunday that they are parting ways with a player favorite coach in Denard Wilson, who was their secondaries coach. The real question is that going to affect the secondary? I mean, they're bringing in potentially a whole new secondary this year, and they're going to have to bring in a new coach. How's that going to work? My only thing that I'm confident is the Tariq Woolen situation was a rookie who played really, really well for the Seahawks last year, and Sean Desai had a part to play in that. So if you're an Eagles fan, it's a good time to be one because there's a lot of optimism that this team can be back to playing good football, great football like they were last year. But it remains to be seen whether these coaching changes are going to be positive or negative. So I am incredibly excited. Moving on to topic number 4, QB landing spots. This is probably one of the most hotly debated topics in the NFL right now because of the uncertainty among QBs and where they're going to land, among analysts and where the QBs are going to land. I started off with Derek Carr, which was number 1 on my list to talk about when I posted my weekly sports news yesterday on Instagram. And Derek Carr just announced that Derek Carr signed with the Saints on a 4-year deal. He is making a bunch of money for those 4 years. I believe it's $150 million. So he's making close to $38 million a year. And ultimately, the way that it looks, he's making about $38 million a year, a little bit less than that. And ultimately, it's a great situation for the Saints, but potentially overpaid. I'm not going to go into an analysis on what I believe Derek Carr is worth. I think he is better than Kirk Cousins, which is saying not a whole lot, but he has an ability to bring them and maybe win them some playoff games. But the truth is he didn't win any in Oakland. And whether that's because of the Raiders' fault, in Las Vegas, because whether that's the Raiders' fault or whether that's his fault remains to be seen. But I'm not incredibly high on him. And I was shocked that he didn't sign with the Jets because personally, from a talent standpoint, I felt like the Jets were a much better place for him to land, but he may have just not liked the way the organization handled things. And so maybe that's why he decided not to, because he was a favorite to fill the void that was at QB for the Jets. So because he signs with the Saints, all of a sudden it makes the Jets very much a needy team, which moves into my next question. Mayfield, where is he going to land? A lot of rumors have him as a potential candidate for the 49ers, and I'm going to go on record in saying that I think this is an excellent fit. He would have a chance to compete with a starting role with Lance while Purdy gets healthy. The real question is he going to get cut once Purdy comes back? And this is the difficult part, because if Purdy doesn't start throwing until training camp or after for the 49ers, can you really cut Mayfield, who maybe could win a job ahead of Lance? I don't think so. I'm pretty high on Trey Lance. And I know a lot of 49ers fans are excited about him, and they should be, but he does get injured. So Mayfield going there ultimately says, look, I'm gambling on the fact that Trey Lance could get injured in the beginning of the season or even earlier in the training camp, and then I become the de facto QB1 with a stacked and loaded team that is definitely a favorite to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. So I think that's where he's going to sign ultimately. He could re-sign with the Rams, certainly. He could go to somewhere like the Jets. I think ultimately his best option is to stay on the West Coast and either stick with the Los Angeles Rams or stick with or go to the San Francisco 49ers. Moving on to the third quarterback, and this is the big one that everyone wants to know about, whether you like him or not. It's Aaron Rodgers. He is in limbo right now because we don't even know if he's playing another snap in football. I believe he will play another year, but I don't think it's going to be, and I'm firmly a believer, even using reports as a backup, that he is not going to be back with the Packers this year. If he is, something crazy would have to happen. He does carry a pretty high price tag, which is the difficulty. It looks like the Panthers were kicking the tires on potentially Rodgers. I don't think that's happening unless they could be a flyer, and that's certainly a possibility. But my personal take is that Rodgers, because of Carr signing with the Saints, I'm a firm believer that he will either sign with the Las Vegas Raiders or the New York Jets. Las Vegas Raiders would pair him up with his old teammate in Devontae Adams, which I think would be a great pair, but do they have the cap space to be able to build a good team while they take on his contract unless he signs a team-friendly contract? I just don't see Rodgers doing that because of his personality. If he goes to the Jets, He's surrounded by Garrett Wilson. He's surrounded by their really, really talented running back, but tore his ACL last year, but should be back. And he's surrounded by a relatively young and good defense. So I think it's an opportunity for him to potentially, that division is in such limbo, because are the Bills going to continue to sort of be this team that is good but can't make it far in the playoffs? Where does Miami stand with their quarterback situation? Could Miami be a flyer for Rodgers? There's so much up in the air right now that it's just really, really difficult to know whether Rodgers decides, you know what, none of these teams look like they are going to be the team that I could win a Super Bowl with. He could retire if that's his view. But ultimately, I really think his top two picks are the Raiders and the Jets. The Raiders because of Adams, and the Jets because of the young talent they have on that team. And the fact that I firmly believe that even though the Bills are the best team right now in that division, I don't believe that they are going to stay the best team in that division. And I would not be surprised if the Bills are only a 10-win team this year. I know that's bold in saying, but I think they're going to have to make changes if they're going to go far in the playoffs. And a lot of people think they're going to be Super Bowl contenders, and they could be, but it's a very, very difficult conference to play in the AFC, and there's a lot of good teams that are coming after them and that are going to be improving during this offseason. So moving on to the fourth and final quarterback that is sort of in limbo where he's going to land is the Lamar Jackson saga. And Lamar Jackson may not even get traded, so this conversation may be futile. But he is on the trading block, whether the Ravens want to admit it or not. He is going to get some suitors who are inquiring as we speak about what the value of Lamar Jackson is. I don't think he's getting moved because of the fact that the Ravens are not prepared, in my opinion, to bring in a rookie quarterback with the talent they have on their team. Now, I'm not a Ravens fan, but I just know that there are needs on that team that if you just remove a star quarterback and plug in a rookie, I don't think you're going to go to the playoffs, and you may not even be a 6-win team without him. I mean, yes, Tyler Huntley was able to barely scrape by with them last year, but it's just one of those situations where I don't see, in my view, Lamar Jackson leaving unless they get a big, big, big set compensation for him. The one team that could provide them with that compensation would be the Atlanta Falcons. They make the most sense from a standpoint of the fact that they tried to pursue Deshaun Watson last year and didn't get him. They were expected to fork out the absolute motherload for him and give him that guaranteed contract that he wanted. So if they were ready to give Deshaun Watson the guaranteed contract, why not give a guy like Lamar Jackson the guaranteed contract? They could pair Lamar with Algier, Patterson, Pitts, and London, along with a decent O-line. They have issues on defense. So that's where it's it'd be interesting. Would it make them the best team in the NFC South? I think it would. Ultimately, the NFC South is not strong, even with the hiring of Derek Carr. Derek Carr is now all of a sudden the best quarterback in the division. And while he's not a bad quarterback, saying he's the best shows you that there's still a lack there. And I'm not trying to be a Derek Carr hater. I think he's a great guy and he's a great teammate, and he will be a great teammate. But I just think Lamar Jackson could have the opportunity to come in there and to potentially rule the division for a couple of years until one of those other teams gets a quarterback that maybe competes for a division title and playoff games. So those are my 4 opinions. I already gave my opinion on how I felt how talented Derek Carr was. Mayfield to the 49ers, Rodgers to the Raiders or the Jets, and Lamar Jackson, if he gets traded, to Atlanta. Moving on to my final topic of the day, which I'm incredibly excited to talk about. This is straying a little bit from football, and I'm going to talk about the 76ers. If you guys want to watch one of the best highlights of the last couple of years, you've got to check out the Sixers' insane comeback versus the Bucks on Saturday. That was one of the better games. It started off very tight. They were going every basket. They were trading baskets, trading buckets, and all of a sudden the Bucks started pulling away. And I started shaking my head because I was like, this is my opinion. This is why they're not making it far in the playoffs. And that's not changed. But it was a very, very entertaining game, and the fourth quarter was just lights out amazing. I mean, Harden was draining shots from the three that was it was just a beautiful sight to see. Him and Joel Embiid and the chemistry they have is absolutely incredible. And I believe that's what could win them playoff games. But my problem is, can they compete with the Milwaukee Bucks or the Boston Celtics? And right now, I don't think so. The Boston Celtics are one of the deepest rosters in the NBA, and I know this for a fact that if you look at the past NBA Finals winners, they have all been incredibly deep rosters, or if they haven't been deep rosters, have gotten the most out of their bench. That's something that the Eagles, unfortunately, have experienced incredible highs and incredible lows. Coaching is ultimately plays a very, very big part in how your second team does. If you're putting your second team in at a time where you know that they're going to be pressured to come back, like let's say your starters are exhausted, but you're down by 15 points and you put your second team in and now all of a sudden they can't keep a lead. They have to get a lead. Those are where coaching, I believe, is an issue and has been an issue for the Sixers. For instance, they had a big lead against the Dallas Mavericks. They blew that lead they had a big deficit against the Dallas Mavericks. The second team for the Sixers did really good and brought it within 6 points. And then Doc Rivers brings back on his starters, and all of a sudden it feels like they just fell off again. And so you've seen multiple things. You've seen the You've seen the 76ers blow these 18-point leads, and you've also seen them come back now to has Saturday and come back and win a game after being down by 18. So ultimately, my opinion on this situation is that coaching is an issue for the 76ers, and until they figure out some of the issues and correct some of the issues that they're making, coaching is going to hold them back. My opinion is, they'll probably win the first round in the playoffs, but if they get to someone like Milwaukee or Boston for a Game 7 series where it is in Boston for 4 games, it would be difficult for the 76ers to be able to pull out a win. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I think it will be difficult. Now, they have, as we speak, 18 games in the season left. But part of that stretch is so rough. They play in a week and a week and a half. They play the Warriors, the Suns, the Nuggets. Well, actually, it's more like 2 weeks. They go through just straight awful 8-game stretch where they play at the Warriors, at the Suns, at the Nuggets. Then they come back home and they get a reprieve and they play the Mavericks and the Raptors. Mavericks are on a tear with scoring with both Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. Then to finish off that wonderful 8-game stretch, they play at Bucks, they play the Celtics and the Heat at home. I think that stretch is going to tell us about who they are as a team and whether they can progress far in the playoffs. If of those 8 games that I just discussed, they win 5, I'd be pretty happy. If they win 4 or 3 of the 8 games, I'd be pretty concerned because if they win 3 of those 8 games, one of them's probably coming to the Raptors, and 2 of them are coming to some of the team's hottest team. Would be coming against some of the hottest teams, but they still be losing to either the Bucks, the Celtics, the Mavericks, the Heat, the Suns, or the Warriors. And those are all really good teams. The Warriors may be experiencing a slump, but they still have the ability to score. And it's going to be something that the 76ers defense is going to struggle with, in my opinion. So that wraps up what I believe the 76ers are going to do. I think they're going to stick with the 3rd seed in the NBA playoffs, and I think they'll probably host someone maybe like the Nets, depending on the play-in tournament. That all is up the air. If they win that first round, maybe it gives them enough confidence to get to the Eastern Conference Final by pulling out another win, but in my honest opinion, I just don't see it happening. Well, guys, that is the end of this first episode. I really appreciate all of you guys who are listening still and have tuned in. Thank you so much for all your support. Please remember to check me out on YouTube, the Long Jawn Podcast, on Twitter, the Long Jawn Pod, on TikTok and Instagram, also the Long Jawn Podcast. Give me a follow, like my post, subscribe. Check out every Sunday where I make my weekly sports news post, which gives a little bit of a highlight on what I'm going to talk about. And ultimately, I'm going to have some guests, so we may stray from some of those topics occasionally, but that's going to give you guys a little bit of an idea, and hopefully gives you an idea of like, hey, I want to tune in for this portion of the segment. So I'm trying to make this across the board, all things sports, and I really hope you enjoyed the time today. And thank you again for all your support. And till next time, guys, I appreciate it. And it's your host, Joseph Camperman, signing out.